For the first time, the extent of Iran's worldwide assassinations, kidnappings, and hostage-taking has been mapped out. The Abdorrahman Boroumand Center for Human Rights has launched an interactive map to document and expose transnational repression by Tehran. The results alarming and a wake-up call to the international community. To dig deeper and find out more, we're joined by Roya Boroumand, a human rights expert and the executive director of the Boroumand Foundation. I'm Negar Mojtahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Roya Boroumand joins us now. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Negar.
Your data mapping tool documents 861 cases of extrajudicial killings, 124 death threats or attempted kidnappings and assassinations since the inception of the Islamic Republic of Iran more than 45 years ago. And of course, there's cases from around the world, from Canada to the US to Turkey to Iraq. Now, you've been a human rights activist and expert for decades. What did an expert like you learn in the process of taking on such a massive endeavor?
Well, as you said, it's a massive endeavor, and we started this when we started our organization 23 years ago now, and we have been working on this and other forms of killings since then. And this particular subject is very difficult in the sense that there is less documentation, that it's very slow. The research is very slow because you have to find people. A lot of these killings happened before the internet existed. And also, you have high-profile people. It's easier to understand the motives. But there are a lot of people who have no high profile but have been effective in doing whatever they were doing, and so they were killed too. And finding the motives for those people takes a long time, and then eliminating cases that are not actually extrajudicial killings or have happened in the framework of something else and reported. Anyways, it's a very long process, but we took this on because we are taking. We are documenting any sorts of violation of the right to life by the government of Iran, the Islamic Republic. But, in 2015, a case was reported in Europe. In 2017, another case was reported in Europe. In 2019, two cases were reported in Afghanistan and Turkey. In 2020, one case, or if not two, were reported in Canada. And we thought that these events become news and then people move on. We usually don't know anything about the investigation. The fact that the American authorities are more vocal and talkative right now is new. Right? The Europeans have often expelled diplomats without saying why they are expelling diplomats. So we thought that it is important to focus on this mode of killing, which is very effective to silence people and to deter people from activism, and make the data easily accessible, not only by the international community, but the public at large, Iranians and non-Iranians, because I think the international community has not taken the measures to make these acts of violence costly for the countries that are doing it. And there is no systematic monitoring that we know of. There needs to be systematic monitoring and transparency, because otherwise the states are encouraged to do this kind of killings, and that's why it happens. You don't do anything that is a deterrent against it, and it will get repeated like any other crime. Impunity brings repetition. So that's what we did, and that's why. And the numbers you gave are the numbers that are now in the database, but the number is much higher. We have more research that hasn't been processed yet, but we also know that the numbers in Iran are extremely low because they almost are the same as the numbers outside Iran, which is impossible. So we believe that. The real number is several times higher, and in the outside Iran also. I mean, you just heard about an American in Iraq who was killed 2 years ago. Well, we didn't know really about it, but it looks like someone who should be, and there are many cases like this. So documenting the non-Iranians is even harder because oftentimes we don't know who they are. There is no sufficient data about them or biography for us to determine why they were killed. And so, yes, the numbers are symbolic, I would say.
Yeah, and it's very important work and a lot of hard work that you put behind it and emotion, I know. So thank you for doing that. And when I was going through your report and I was clicking on the maps, there was a lot of people that, as a journalist, I went, oh, I've interviewed that person or I've come across that person. People that are not as high profile, for example, as, Masih Ali-Nejad or John Bolton, who we've also had on the show here for Eye for Iran, who I was like, oh, I didn't know that they were actually threatened or something happened to them by the Islamic Republic. So I found really the extent and the depth of cases quite shocking. Was there anything that surprised you in the process of doing this?
Maybe, no, the extent of death threats were not necessarily shocking for me. What was shocking a little bit was the arrogance with which it happens, meaning like they can go in the office of a doctor who is organizing protests in Switzerland, in Geneva, and in person threaten. And the extent to which people are not willing to talk about it, because oftentimes these threats are transmitted through their parents in Iran, that they are accompanied with other threats, and so they are reluctant. And they don't want to publicize it because they're worried for their relatives. And so we expected a much easier research than the killings. And actually, it's not. It's not a very easy research either. And then also, internet threats that are real, but at the same time, they could be zealots, right? So determine which one is really linked to a state policy targeting that particular person, or some, state supporters that are very zealous.
And I guess that all goes back to, like you said, fear and the culture of impunity when there are no consequences for what happens. Can you talk a little bit about the profile that you've noticed in terms of the types of targets that the Iranian government is after? And I know, of course, your own father was on this list as well. Can you tell our viewers about Dr. Abdorrahman Boroumand, the namesake of your foundation?
Well, my father was a lawyer and a pro-democracy activist. He was, he and his closest ally started one of the first, the first opposition movement to the Islamic Republic in 1980. And they were active ever since. And now they are both dead. In 91, with a interestingly enough, there was an attempt against my father's friend and the leader of the movement, Shapur Bakhtiar, and in 1980, and it was a Lebanese team, but they were arrested. They couldn't get into the apartment, but they killed a policeman, a French policeman, and they killed even Bakhtiar's neighbor because they rang at the wrong door, and they wounded her sister, and one policeman was paralyzed for life, and so they were arrested. There is like tragedy over tragedy. They were arrested and sentenced to life in prison. And then in the mid-'80s, there were some bombs exploding in some public places like department stores and other public places. And a small group from Lebanon that was also had claimed responsibility for the bombing of the U.S. Embassy, the attack of U.S. Embassy, claimed responsibility and asked for the release of this killing team, who was headed by someone called Anis Naqash, or whatever their pronunciation. And so, these people were not released immediately, but the negotiations went on, and there was a killing in 1989 of a very, very influential Kurdish leader. And then there was the killing in Geneva of UN professor who was active at the UN and was the brother of the leader of the Mujahideen, Kazem Rajavi. And then there was the killing in 1990 of, also the same year, of Cyrus Elahi, who was also the number 2 of an organization that a monarchist organization, but whose leader has been also threatened multiple times and moved around. So then, this team is released, and they go to Iran, obviously, and a few months later, my dad is killed, and Bakhtiar, 4 months later. So somehow, the message, I don't know what the negotiations were about, but they certainly were not about Iran not eliminating people on the French territory. And so after these killings, there was another group of Kurdish leaders who were machine gunned in 1992 in a restaurant in Germany, in a Greek restaurant called Mykonos. So the Mykonos case became a very important case because a defector from Iran, from Iran's intelligence, came out and provided information that was verifiable. And basically, for the first time, Iran was accused, really, of being behind the killings, and the Minister of Intelligence was convicted. So we hadn't had that before. In France, the trial of Elahi let go of the killer, and the trial of Bakhtiar, let go of the Iranian diplomat who had been extradited from Switzerland. So the efforts had been not to involve Iran and not to make the cases politically sensitive, too politically sensitive. So, but this time around, so in 1997, the ruling came out, and the Europeans withdrew their ambassadors from Iran. And because of this and the Rushdie cases, there seems to have been, but not for long, not for long, and not affecting much the relationship with Iran, because during the same period where the investigation of the Mykonos trial was happening, the Minister of Intelligence came to Germany and went back. And so, there has been, the message to Iran has been that, it's okay, as long as you don't kill us, you can kill your people. But then, Iran may have committed not to kill people in Europe, and the numbers went down, obviously, and also all the leaders of these political groups had been killed. So there was not much to kill, but then there were some killings in the 2000s in Spain and in France and in Tajikistan, and these were Zoroastrians. So members of the Zoroastrian community who were particularly active in revitalizing the culture of ancient Iran and promoting it and publishing and even the religion Zoroastrianism, and these were framed as ordinary crimes, and they weren't framed as political crimes but ordinary crimes. But so these were the leaders. I mean, going back to your question, these were obvious targets. But the targets are not always that obvious. You have an influential singer, Farrokhzad, who was killed. You have a pilot who had taken a jet from Iran and gone to Iraq and then pretty quickly to Germany, and he had said that he doesn't think that the war, he was against the Iran-Iraq war and the continuation of the war. He was killed. Another pilot was killed in Switzerland, and then some random Kurdish activists were killed in Sweden, and it was very hard to know why, but so the targeted another leftist activist was trapped basically, but he went to visit his mother in Cyprus, and they had followed obviously his mother. The whole thing was a trap. Jamshid Sharmat, for example, was kidnapped in Dubai and executed not long ago, as was Zam, who was Ruhollah Zam, who was kidnapped in Iraq and taken to Iran and executed. And some other people have disappeared. For example, the head of a TV station, a satellite TV station, that seems to have had a lot of entertainments for Iranians. He disappeared, and the movement that Sharmat was part of, the head of that movement was in Turkey, and they found the car, 3 people in that car, and no one knows where they are. And this happened a few years before Sharmat. And actually, there was someone who was arrested. There was someone who was trying to recruit someone to kill Sharmat in the U.S. And he had stopped traveling for that purpose for a long time. These are not your typical profiles, because these are mostly active on the internet, right? So they are not armed, they are not. And Sharmat was linked to bombings, but the link is really not very well substantiated, and there are a lot of contradictions in the state statements, in the authority statement about what was this bombing. Anyway, so these are very diverse kind of people, and so there is punitive killing and deterrent, and people who have to stop, and it's a message, right? Like, they kill one person, and the message is given to all the people surrounding that person and people who hear about that person. It's not like just people who fight them actively or people who have a history of fighting them with arms. It's not what they do. They also kill people who are compromisers and who are negotiating, who want to negotiate with them, because in fact they want everyone to be very radical, to be dismissed. And so if like a Kurdish group doesn't believe in armed struggle and believes that elections should be used as a means to disseminate demands, they also are killed, which you would wonder, like. So, it's we've learned a lot during this process. And I think that this has to be understood, these patterns and the scope of these killings have not been understood properly.
Yeah, it seems like a very wide range, like you said, from anyone who basically speaks out against the Islamic Republic to people doing some work on the internet to then people who have a network and areas of influence in Iran, all things that I guess the Islamic Republic fears for their own existence, right?
I mean, they lose each time Iranians have hope in some improvement and they are disappointed. They, for example, they turn away from the religion too, because the religion is now the state, and so part of the reason why all of the grand ayatollahs didn't vote for the Islamic Republic referendum was that they thought that Islam running the country, like clerics running the country, will hurt Islam. And they were right, because people become, convert to Christianity, to Baha'is, to Baha'ism, to Zoroastrianism. They are losing their Muslims. And so their reaction to that is to eliminate. Instead of trying to solve the problem, the root cause of the problem, they eliminate the temptations, what they think are temptations, whether they put them in prison or they have killed them. It's just, they proceed always by removing the symptom of the problem, but the root cause is never taken care of. I mean, it's never addressed, because that means that they have to give up power.
And speaking of this elimination that you spoke of, what are some of the tactics that they're using to employ that?
So the tactics have been diverse and have changed over time. In the 80s, they were using members of Hezbollah, and there are also Hezbollah members in Turkey, like Islamist groups that have been influenced by them or, have been inspired by the Iranian Revolution. But their own agents were also involved. Like, they would come, they would be involved in locating, in the organizing of the logistics, in providing explosives or arms or whatever was needed. And so they were also carrying out, for example, the pilot in Switzerland was killed by an Iranian agent. In Sweden, people were killed by an Iranian agent. But with time, they started to remove their own agents and let their proxies do the killings, as it seems like it has happened in Iraq not long ago, right? That the Revolutionary Guard captain is using Iraqi proxies to get an American citizen assassinated. And then, more recently, you see that, so then they started to frame, like in Europe at least, to frame killings as ordinary crimes, or not leaving a trace, or because some of these killings they also left a message, like in some of these killings they left a baseball cap each time, right? Or they left they let the arms not far, or there were receipts of rental cars, and that could trace them.
So what was the baseball cap about? I'm just curious. What kind of symbol? What kind of symbol is the baseball cap?
I don't know. I mean, it represents America, and so I mean, who else? And so it must have to do with the fact that anyone against them is American, an American stooge, American grouplets. That's how they called the Mujahideen. So I assume that that's what it is. But now it looks like they are using criminal gangs, and more often criminal gangs, even to organize the killings. They've done that in Turkey. They've done that obviously in Canada and here. And in London, Chechens, and there was a person in front of Masih's house after all the all the news came out about the plan to kidnap. And the guy, is like obviously an, a big beard with a gun in his hand. I mean, it looks like these are disposable people, right? So they're using people who, if arrested, is not causing much harm to their networks and organizations. That's my assess. I mean, there may be other reasons, but for me, these people are, if they succeed, that's so much the better. It costs some money. And if they're arrested, there are other criminal gangs, and there is no leaks or no intelligence that will get to the Western authorities about their sleeper cells or their diplomats involved.
Yeah, like you said, they're disposable, and at the same time, it's a form of kind of like buying loyalty. And now there's a Bloomberg report out saying that the Islamic Republic is employing minors to carry out attacks on Israelis and Jews as well.
I mean, miners, they were demining the war, during the Iraq war, there were many miners who were walking on mines with a key to paradise on her neck because, Iran wanted to advance. And so this is not new. They recruited also just during the revolutionary time a lot of high school students, and taught them how to use arms. And that's why also a lot of the Islamic Republic bases are pretty young. Like, they started very early. So 45 years later, they're not that old. So we can't count on them dying of natural causes very soon.
And how would you compare Iran's transnational repression with other rogue countries like Russia and China, for example?
Look, I'm not an expert on those killings. I assume that China, at least in terms of threats and intimidation, because it's such a big country and there is such a big and there is a big diaspora. I assume that they do a lot. Russians, they have been doing. I mean, Iran has learned from the KGB playbook, so they've been doing this before Iran, and so I can't tell you about the numbers, but I think that Iran, for the size of the country and for the stakes, has been very has not been hesitant in killing, and has managed the cost of it, but the very fact of not getting into trouble with host countries has not been a deterrent enough, because the host countries have not necessarily consistently taken the right measures.
So, like you just mentioned, that a lot of these host countries where these attempted assassinations or sometimes killings are happening are invoking potentially national security or perhaps prioritizing economic and political interests ahead of actually doing something, sometimes even allowing a lot of these agents to go. Tell us more about that.
Well, I mean, I can't read their minds, but what is certain is that they have several concerns. One concern is security. Obviously, I assume that they have said that they fear retaliation, that Iran would repeat the bombings that they did in France to get their people released. But that's only part of it. But I think that at the time when my father and Bakhtiar and Elahi were killed, there were negotiations going on to settle, or the Eurodif problem. There was a huge contention. a huge dispute between Iran and France over a $1 billion loan for building a nuclear facility in France. And so that seemed to have settled around that time, and no economic measure was taken in response to these killings. And even, Mitterrand the French president was going to travel to Iran, and they were not, it took some activism and some advocacy to deter him from visiting Iran right after these killings. So, and one of I can talk better about Iran, about France, because that's where I was, but they call it this minor incidents are not going to affect our relationship. But when they withdrew their ambassadors from Iran in 1997, they got Iran to back, and to commit to not kill on their territories. So action and, a multilateral action does have an impact on the Islamic Republic, but unfortunately it's not consistently the path adopted by these states.
And what do you hope to achieve with the results that you found and all this work that you put into it?
Well, we have many objectives. One thing is that people who have been killed need to be memorialized and not forgotten. And not only high-profile people remembered, but everyone we can, is also for the public to understand how serious this is, and perhaps put pressure on their governments to act more in line with their obligation to protect, the duty to protect, and obligation to ensure that justice is done and that necessary measures are taken to protect people. And then, we are hoping that maybe, looking at this massive number and database and the information in it, and knowing that countries like Russia, China are killing, Pakistan has killed, but also Rwanda and Ethiopia. And this is because the consequences are not deterrent. They're not sufficient to deter these countries. The international community should also set up a body to monitor systematically all of these killings, because we have special rapporteurs for China, special rapporteur for Iran, special rapporteur, but these rapporteurs mostly work on what happens inside the countries. They are not special rapporteurs for the UK or for France or for Germany, or, so these cases are not monitored, and the governments are not engaged, by the UN to figure out a solution. So I think that we are hoping that, first of all, we encourage other countries other victims to do something similar for their own countries, but also to that there is a monitoring system that reports about these killings wherever they happen, so that Iran believes, Iran is deterred because they know that it's not going to be forgotten, that it's going to be investigated and it's going to be reported on. So that is a very effective way to deter Iran, other than other measures, political and economic measures.
Actually, one of the cases that you profiled in your report is that of Canada's former Justice Minister, Professor Irwin Cotler. And I spoke to him a few weeks ago, and he actually had a one-on-one conversation with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And he suggested to him, similar to what you're saying, that to have some sort of task force in place to deal with transnational repression. And that the G7 is happening, the meeting is happening in Canada soon. And he was suggesting to the Prime Minister for Canada to actually take the lead on that. Now, Dr. Kotler is, of course, very high profile. He is under 24/7 police protection here in Canada, so he feels very comfortable speaking out. But of course, there's a lot of people who don't. So what is your advice to anyone who has felt or feels threatened by the Islamic Republic?
Well, I think that they have to report it. They have to make these threats public so that, it doesn't, because, silence encourages repetition, right? It's like, impunity encourages repetition. Silence also encourages repetition because it means that, and we don't know how many people have been threatened and have self-censored. We only know of people who have talked about it, but we have to talk about it. I mean, this is not something that is personal. This is a public security problem, and individuals have to talk about it. They have to bring out information about what they know, people who have been killed. Even the governments on whose territory people have been killed have to, make the truth public. I mean, part of justice is the knowledge of the truth for the victims, but also for the society at large. And that has been withheld. And I know that there may be security issues, and with the sources, intelligence sources may be revealed, and maybe at risk. We understand that it's not an easy ask, but for older cases where things that have happened 40 years ago and 30 years ago, they don't have this problem anymore because so I'm sure that there are ways to actually tell part of the truth or the truth without endangering sources.
And emotionally, how did you feel? Walk us through this process. This is obviously, as we mentioned before, a massive endeavor, and it's quite heavy, and I'm sure weighs heavy on your heart too. How were you feeling emotionally throughout this whole process?
Well, it's true that this investigation is particularly close to home, and that it has been difficult. It has been, and maybe part of why it has been also a little bit slower is that, but I think that you get involved in any injustice that you document. Somehow, yes, this is closer to home. You get maybe more angry at what should have happened that hasn't happened. You get more outraged and saddened when you think that perhaps the state knew that it was going to happen and didn't do anything about it. But at the end of the day, we are one of millions of people who have lost their loved ones. So I think, it's hard, but it's not impossible.
And do you feel that it moves you and everyone in all these cases that are now involved in, moves you towards more justice?
I think the truth is the first step to justice. And so we cannot try to solve a problem if we don't know what the problem is. And so what we do is to expose the problem and then try to figure out the solution or try to help or suggest. But without exposing the problem and the scope of the problem, it is very hard to expect action.
Yes, that was beautifully said. Now, your work is far from over. How can people get involved and report their cases to you if they want to get involved?
Well, they can, in all of these cases of people killed, there is a form that they can click on and complete the information or give new information. They can contact us through our website and let us know that they have information. They can support in many ways. They can help us investigate and come to us with more data than what they know or with some contacts, they can also support us, in many different ways. They can support us financially. They can, they can encourage us. They can also go and look at these cases, because that also encourages us. When people go and read and click on many of these cases and get to know about it, I think, this is also a great source of encouragement and empowers us.
It definitely does. And visually, it really puts, a face to what is happening right now and where and the overall scope, like you said. And just remind me again, for those who don't know, your website?
IranRights.org.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. That's Roya Boroumand.
Thank you, Negar, for having me.
We'd love to know what you thought of this episode. Leave us a comment. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.